Right, hello. It's going to be a slightly unusual episode of the Sisyphus complex solution this week, because this is going to be kind of more of a standalone episode. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's been quite a few things going on this week that have been somewhat mental, and as the UK has re-entered lockdown again for no legitimate reason whatsoever, you'll probably be able to tell from the opening screen alone as to what this is going to be all about, and hence why I'm going to have the title of this as a party political broadcast. I did do a short earlier on in the week that was based on how people can undertake processes to start making their voices known. If anybody hasn't seen that one yet, it's called Changing Lanes, and take a look at that. It gives some advice as to how you go about the process. And I did, within that episode, mention a couple of new parties for people to consider, because it's quite apparent that none of the major parties are going to be of any assistance in any of this. They're all quite plainly equally signed up to this Great Reset nonsense, which is where all of these bullshit figures are coming out from. And so at that particular point in time, I did say that there were alternatives for people to consider, and at that point I did say that there was a choice between the Heritage Party and the Reclaim Party being one that's started by Laurence Fox. Subsequently, there's been the announcement that Nigel Farage is now looking to officially rename the Brexit Party as the Reform Party. But I looked at these options to give some consideration, and in case anybody's not heard my opinion on this previously, the Laurence Fox Reclaim Party, I think, is going to be relevant to a certain degree, but that is going to be very much centred around cultural aspects, I would imagine, because he's very much in the limelight over freedom of speech and taking things forward around that perspective, and making sure that people are allowed to express their opinions and try to maintain certain areas of historical relevance, culture, etc. But it's going to be a fairly limited perspective as far as I'm concerned. Who knows, he might change, but I can't see it, because I don't think he's got that mindset, and I don't think the people behind him have got the right level of wide and varied experience to be able to put together something in terms of being a realistic prospect for being able to handle the running of a nation. In terms of Nigel Farage's Reform Party, I think essentially they had the opportunity last year in December to be able to have a foothold and to be able to hold the blue socialist pretend conservatives to account, and they bottled it. Nigel essentially worked out an agreement with them that they wouldn't stand against the Conservatives in various seats and all that sort of stuff. And he played silly buggers, which means that, again, previously it was the Brexit Party, it was the UKIP, which was anti-European Union. Then it was the Brexit Party, which was to try to force the government into actually leaving the European Union based on a legitimate referendum, but still single issue. And now he's coming back for this Reform Party to turn around and say, well, okay, he's anti-lockdown. Well, again, that's single issue. This is not a realistic proposition. So on that basis, I've looked at the Heritage Party, and I'm going to be, a lot of this is very much off the cuff, by the way, because I've been busy with other things. I'm going to run through the reason why the Heritage Party are much more advanced and a much more realistic proposition insofar as taking things forward are concerned. How they do already have a manifesto, which I will run through, and how the developments of the Sisyphus complex solution in recreating the Hoskins wiring map can fit into the behind the scenes developments, because whether I've mentioned this previously or not I can't remember, but a manifesto is essentially what would be the equivalent in private equity as a pitch deck. It's like an executive summary. These are the key bullet points that we'd like to present a persuasive case in order for you to be able to dig deeper. Now, digging deeper beyond a manifesto or a pitch deck, you then have to go into the full business plan. What is it that party would actually do underneath? And I think that's where the developments of the recreation of the John Hoskins wiring map, and that can come in handy. I'm not going to make any claim whatsoever that I have any particularly significant role in anything so far. I've had a couple of backwards and forwards with David Curtin. I will disclose that I am now, for the first time in my life, officially a member of a political party. I have signed up to be a member of the, well, not to be a member, I've become a member of the Heritage Party. Anybody can do it, and I do recommend it. The links will be in the description and that for you to sign up. Membership is only £25. Then you can give a donation as well if you like. If, because of the way things are at the moment, even handing over £25 becomes a bit of an issue for you, it doesn't matter. There's the ability to volunteer as well. There needs to be a wide network of people, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be forking over the money that you might not have at this time. So never worry about being unable to afford something. Just think about the time and the volunteering that you could be able to do, and whether at the right point you might be able to even put yourself forward for a whole range of seats that are going to become available, right from councillor through to MP level. You have to remember the amount of seats there are in the country and the number of council seats there are in the country. If you want to know exactly what those numbers are, go back to the early stages of the Sisyphus complex solution, because I haven't written it down and I can't remember offhand. But there's plenty of room and opportunity for people. And the good thing is that at this particular stage, like I said, we do get the opportunity to be able to provide some input as to what kind of direction the country should be taking. It's particularly important at this point in time, as far as I'm concerned, because with the developments in America, there was always a certain amount of potential that a lot of the lunacy, which, let's face it, has come out of people that have come out of both America and the UK, and then obviously the likes of Germany and whatever, and that, because I mean, when it comes down to the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, those are where the key influences are coming from. There was a potential opportunity that some of the real problems could be staved off with the re-election of Donald Trump. That's it. There was always a little bit of uncertainty there, because a great deal of the actions that had been anticipated for the longest time have just not come to fruition, and it seems to be more of a case of people on the internet saying that things are about to take place rather than them actually taking place. But seeing as we have got that situation where it's quite clear that the likes of Biden, and over here and that with Boris, and I dare say there might be other locations around the world as well, when they're all pushing this very same World Economic Forum based Build Back Better bullshit, we know who we're fighting against. And the fortunate thing is is that the likes of David Curtin does actually recognise what the Great Reset is. He does understand what Agenda 21 is. He does understand what Agenda 2030 is. So you're not dealing with somebody that is just sitting back and trying to pretend that nothing exists and everything's a conspiracy theory. Things are potentially going to get very, very dirty in a number of different locations, and as much as we want to be able to do things to maintain some level of decency, should be done on a political level. I think things are going to take a different turn, because when you've essentially ended up in a scenario of what can only be termed appeasement, then the chances are that there's going to be an awful lot of things that take place that could and should have been avoided. It's quite clear that this long march through the institutions, which as much as a lot of that is based around accusations of this being some sort of long-term communist agenda that's suddenly coming to the fore and all that sort of thing, I'm less convinced of that. I do think it is very much more in line with developments based from where appeasement does become a much more relevant piece of terminology, shall we say. Obviously out in the States, it's not happening quite so much over here just yet. There's been sporadic bits and pieces of it, and there has been sporadic bits and pieces of it out in Europe as well. But when you've had the useful idiots, I mean the list of useful idiots is very, very long. But in terms of the ones that are absolutely determined to make this into much more aggressive than a political battle, there's been instances whereby you have the likes of the Antifa and Black Lives Matter, who are the prime candidates for being the frontline useful idiots, a bunch of bloody soy boys and retards, being the exact opposite of what they claim to be. I mean, they literally are the fascists. And as far as I'm concerned, and the one little piece of, not that I've practiced, but the little bit of drama that I'll include here, is that when these little shits have been out in America, and this past week, going around with little box cutters and slashing at people who dare have a different opinion to them, who dare not be so gullible and stupid to be the appeasers. Well, I think there's going to have to be a percentage of people that are prepared to understand the old Crocodile Dundee reference, whereby when the little boys turn up to a fight with a box cutter, you literally turn around and say, "Nah, mate, that's not a knife. This is a knife." Okay? If these little shits want to go the whole way, fair enough. Let them have a little bit of a taste. If that's the direction that this is going to have to go in, then let them know that, yeah, you want to play big boy. See what you get when you play with a big boy. Because it makes no sense for people to not understand how this ended up the last time that you had all these wimpy little appeasers. And when you have a scenario whereby those useful idiots will go around causing the damage and intimidation towards regular people the way they do. Yeah, it does become a case of not only just having a voice. You'll hope that that's enough, but you also need to be prepared to stand there and say, no, I'll be prepared to back up my voice as well. If that's the way they want to play it, then ho hum. And I'm sure David won't appreciate me doing something like this, but you know, fuck it. There's got to be some reality in this. So, in terms of making sure that we can do things on a more peaceful method, like I say, that won't be down to us. That'll be their decision, not ours. If they want to play that game, fair enough. But let's have a look and see why it is that I've chosen the Heritage Party to be able to recommend as a option for people to be putting themselves forward. Okay, because this is the only party that I see that is an official registered party that has actually got some sort of plan that isn't single issue or essentially doing their own version of appeasement, which essentially happened last year with the Brexit Party. So, into the first aspect. Under the heading that they have, that David has produced for financial responsibility. At the top we have the Stopping Wasting Vanity projects. Now you'll notice that falls directly in line with something that I've already stated within the Sisyphus complex solution. So there's alignment there straight away, and there are certain projects that I could actually pass on and say, okay, these are very, very specific. He does actually mention things like HS2, which is the high-speed line heading up north. Whether I particularly agree with that one or not, it doesn't really matter at this stage, because obviously, I spent a lot of time out in Japan, so I do see the benefits of a high-speed train. But I understand the feelings of people across the UK, and as I've said a number of times before, the Sisyphus complex solution and recreating that Hoskins wiring map is not about Paulism. It's about what the majority would want to see take place. So if so many people turn around and said, right, within this development, if we were to take things forward and we were to work together with people like the Heritage Party, then sure. If they don't want HS2, so be it. I'm not wedded to it. In the larger scheme of things, it's not that big of a fucking deal to me. So the efficient use of taxpayer money, obviously, these are things that should be common sense, but seldom are, and certainly are not in the Conservative Party right now, the pretend Conservative Party. There is no efficient use of taxpayer money. There is just a massively burgeoning debt based on retard policies that are claiming to have science behind it, but having absolutely no science behind it whatsoever. And then they're just printing money that doesn't exist. Basically, they're turning the country into it's like a monopoly board. Let's just create some money out of nothing. It's lunacy. So, efficient use of taxpayers' money and the responsible monetary policy. That's an area where, that particular area, and that I haven't come across yet in terms of the developments through the recreation of the wiring diagram, or wiring map. But it is quite plain that the Bank of England is the tool that is used to be able to print the monopoly money. So there's certain areas around that I will go into at a later stage. Reducing debt. Again, that's something else that I'll run into a little bit more later on, because there is a particular graph that I will show at the right time that shows where an awful lot of the debt actually does lay, and it sure as hell isn't with the regular folk. As much as we have this continual bombardment of another area of panic porn around consumer debt, that by far is not where the largest problem lays, I can assure you. But like I said, I will present those details when the appropriate time comes. Developing a sovereign wealth fund. Obviously, that's something where Norway is a model for that, I'm imagining. But then that's a sovereign wealth fund based on, and you tend to find most sovereign wealth funds are actually based off of domestic oil production. The practicalities around that would need much more of a deeper dive. But in terms of an aim and a goal, yeah, potentially. I mean, obviously, that reducing the debt and all this sort of stuff, and that ends up being the primary goal. I mean, you can't develop a sovereign wealth fund and that whilst you're still massively in debt, at least not to my mind, because otherwise then you run into the problem of the responsible monetary policy. So anyway, these are the goals that are part of the manifesto as it stands, the pitch deck as it stands. Ending the burgeoning third sector. Now this is part of where we do start to see the fight back against the loony lefties and the Great Reset and the United Nations. Because as you'll know from the series thus far, I have pointed out how, so for example, I think it was in last week's episode where I pointed out how one of the MPs had been up the dispatch box and said that this critical race theory was actually illegal within the UK and it would not be accepted within government and so forth. And yet I identified how they were actually paying other organisations to do precisely that. That ends up being part of the third sector. We do have the problem, as I've identified previously, with the third sector and that being responsible for some horrendous crimes, including the paedophilia and the rapes and so forth. These types of areas and that have got to be clamped down on, and this is the only party and the only person that I've seen anywhere within politics that is actually stating an understanding around this as to where all of these problems actually come from. So this part of your fiscal responsibility, not paying for your own demise, would be a very good way of summing that one up. So coming across somebody that actually understands that particular element is quite critical, and I do think that people should really pay attention to something like that. If you're going to get involved in politics, if you're going to just simply vote, if you've got a party that understands these kind of problems, you need to be keeping a very close eye on them, because these are the ones that are going to be against the appeasement. All right, so let's move into the next part. There are several steps, by the way, obviously. Right, so the Heritage Party believes in a low tax economy. There are a couple of aspects within the whole manifesto where I will be pinpointing where I think there are some slightly unusual perspectives, but like I say, because I'm not about Paulism, I'm about what the wider goals are and wider opinions. I can obviously make my opinions known, and we'll see how it goes. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be a loony lefty in that way. Say if I don't get my own way, I'm going to walk around with me box cutter. No, I'll be the one that stand behind with a fucking sword. But anyway, low tax economy makes sense. Always makes sense. Only, of course, if you've made sure that government is reduced to such a size that it is concentrated on the responsibilities that are the essential parts of government and not all of the other nonsense that, as you'll have known from the process that I've been running so far, that show how many departments are just completely redundant and pointless, doing the exact same thing as another department, or doing nothing at all being ideologically driven. So, like with the Met Office last week, how that can be just taken out of government completely. I don't care if it did make the enormous sum of £8 as a net contribution. Pathetic. But anyway, removing all that kind of stuff will enable a low tax economy. When people turn around and say that if taxation is not at a higher level, and the absolute idiotic notion that only the wealthy should pay high taxes and everybody else should be let up. I mean, because in the UK, I mean, the stand, you're looking at something like around about 20% at the moment, I believe, for your regular income tax, and then on top of that you got your national insurance, and then obviously in that you then ended up with things like your VAT and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's essentially going into Gordon Brown territory, where you're getting something like around about 99.9 pence in the pound going through to the Treasury. I mean, it's become absolutely farcical. And the average Joe blogs, you need as much of your own hard-earned income as you possibly can. And this is where it does become this understanding with the public again, that in order for the government to be responsible and accountable, individuals have to be responsible and accountable as well. So that can be achieved in a low tax economy, providing that both sides of the coin end up understanding what those responsibilities are. That could end up being a long process, because people have obviously been indoctrinated over a ridiculous period of time now, and that where everybody seems to think that the government's responsible for everything. Well, they're not. And if you want to be able to maintain your freedoms, you might need to grow up and understand these things. Now, the responsible taxation part of things, where large multinationals pay their fair share, that to me does seem like a little bit of a pander, and not the black and white type. Bad joke. Removing loopholes, yes, that I definitely understand. But this is where an awful lot of stuff becomes a case of having to take things back to their core function, because the tax laws, and keep in mind the tax laws are actually not written by government. They're written by the very same accounting firms, particularly the big four accounting firms, who then know what the loopholes are that they've advised, and then advise those companies of how to get around the laws that they've just recommended. And that is actually a fact. So taking simplification of the tax laws is long overdue. And that's where you need to be able to take things back to what its core function is supposed to be. So when you do set a responsible taxation policy, and you do say to corporations, irrespective of their size as far as I'm concerned, when you say what that tax percentage is supposed to be, make sure it's at a level that is responsible, not only in terms of ensuring that those taxes get paid and that there are no loopholes, but making sure that it is also not so obtrusive as to cause harm to the potential of a larger corporation. Because as I've been going through the business, oh god, what they're called again? What was it? Business Energy Industrial Strategy Department. What you will have noticed from within that so far is how many areas of government programs there are, and that to be able to provide grant funding and so forth, which basically just means giving them money to assist with research and development and so forth. If you remove those types of programs, then it becomes more incumbent on those larger organisations to be able to pay for their own R&D, which then means that they need to be having sufficient wiggle room to be able to have retained earnings that can cover those costs. And you will be putting impediment in their place if the taxation that you put on an organisation is too large. So again, this is something that requires good, sensible, intelligent thought processes to be able to develop such a plan around that. But I understand the principle for it, and I think most people do as well. Well, I would hope that, but apart from lefties, obviously. Reducing regulations. Yes, to a point. Again, that becomes a very complex consideration, whereby it's less a matter of reducing regulations in order to be able to enable standards to drop, and it's more a case of having a common sense perspective, whereby the concentration on regulation then becomes having some very limited but stable and manageable regulations to ensure quality, and where any costs to be able to back that up can be levied towards oversight with teeth, I suppose, might be a reasonable way to put it. Because one of the key problems that we do have is the fact that and as I've been demonstrating through the organisations that I've listed within the World Economic Forum, they will commit crime after crime after crime after crime, and nothing seems to be done. Or, as I have also demonstrated, that any fines that are levied towards them doesn't matter to them, because then they get it back in grant funding, which then leads into the second part of ending crony capitalism. So those types of things need to go hand in hand. So this also does kind of lead towards the criticism that I've got of suggesting that there would be belief in a free market economy, because it's not going to be a free market economy. It is going to be a regulated market. So it's this matter of understanding terminology again. I mean, obviously, quite plainly says, we're going to be reducing regulations. Doesn't say they're going to be removing regulations. So therefore, it's not a free market economy. So things like this mean that we need to be able to express things factually as they are, so that the public understand. Because if it goes forward by stating free market economy, obviously people are going to be somewhat confused, and they will think that it literally is a free-for-all. Everybody can do whatever the hell they want, and that's just simply not going to be the case. And because of that, that's why I've highlighted within ending crony capitalism, where it does stipulate mixed economy and the third way as being a part of the problem, and this socialism by stealth. Well, a mixed economy does have a range of different definitions, unfortunately. And the simple fact of the matter there is that if you do have a responsible market rather than a free market, which does have logical but not overly burdensome regulations, then it is essentially a mixed economy. Especially because if you are maintaining any social policy developments within the government, if you are maintaining, say for example, if you do maintain the NHS, if you do maintain even down to things like policing and the armed forces, and any kind of, if they maintain the welfare state, more importantly, then you are looking at a mixed economy. So again, I think there does need to be some reclamation as to what these words actually mean. And as much as I understand that, yes, a mixed economy is something that is being bastardized by this socialism by stealth, I do think that the reclaim part, as in terms of Lawrence Fox's party is concerned, reclaiming words and what they actually mean should be a part of it. So it would, to my mind, this would be very much more accurately described as a mixed economy rather than a free market economy. So that's at least in terms of intention, it's sound relatively. Like I say, we have to be going into the business plan side of things. Natural monopolies. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the highlighted ones of rail, water, and energy, I do agree that part privatisation constitutes the worst of all worlds. I do, and have demonstrated, I think, before, and that's in terms of the price caps within the energy sector, and that they just make no sense whatsoever. And generally speaking, the price cap is put at a level that is above market value. So again, totally irrelevant. I mean, that is literally trying to put lipstick on a pig. I'm not convinced that rail, water, and energy should be going back into public hands. However, at the same time, I'm also not convinced that they should be open to foreign investment either. I think it's about time that the organisations and the individuals within the UK that are involved within the private equity markets, it's about time they stood up and took some responsibility within their own nation. It could very well be a case that these sectors become public for a period of time, but a very specified period of time, in order to be able to make that transition. But I do believe that foreign ownership in these areas is a mistake. So that would be, again, part of a conversation to be had. Yeah, I think that'll do for that part. Right, let's move on, because, like I say, there's a few to get through. Equality before the law. This should be just plain and simple. The additional part, the right at the top, and that's, yes, as I've already stated, and that people are responsible for their own actions. This level of people understanding, once again, what responsibility is across so many different elements of society. Personal responsibility is just, it's such a, it's ridiculous that it would even have to be introduced again, and for people to be reminded of it. But obviously that's going to have to be the case, because I mean, one of the critical parts to this is, if people understand responsibility, then they're going to be far less taken in by the amount of lies and bullshit that are being spread at the moment, whether that be to do with this COVID crap, or the environmental bullshit, or any of the other left-wing retard bloody yapping points. If you've got the responsibility yourself, you're more likely to turn around and go, hang on a minute, now how is this going to affect me? Should I realistically be looking at things in a little bit more detail to understand whether there is going to be some cost-benefit analysis required here, and that, because it is going to impact. If people have got responsibility, they're less likely to be such gullible bedwetters. Areas like that need to be brought back, and you'll also end up with a far less grouping of appeasers, a few more Churchills, and a few less, what was his name, Edwards, Anyway, equality under the law. Equality under the law already essentially exists. So it's a matter of making sure that, as it quite rightly points out, we do not end up with activists, magistrates, judges, police officers, so forth, and we do remove any of this ridiculous lunatic as it's coming into, and that with the crime over ideology, getting rid of all of the lunatic rubbish of the hate crimes, which I think he does go into as well, and that in a different part, but they're just absolutely lunatic rubbish, and that the police are wasting their time on, as to whether somebody said something online that somebody's been offended by. I mean, grow up, as part one. We do not end up with anything that is based on I can't remember what the actual laws are now, where, so for example, whether it's down to work-based selections, MP selections, or any kind of selection process, if anything is weighted against or in favour of a particular grouping, then that should be made illegal. Everything should be down to equality. Everybody is equal. End of story. No more of this trying to push this division, pushing one up against the other. These types of areas, and that it should be common sense, but obviously the common sense needs to then be reintroduced. Within the crime over ideology, he has identified increasing stop and search. Oh, so that's where he goes into the hate speech laws. Yeah, get rid of that sort of rubbish. In terms of increasing stop and search, I don't know. I would need to look into that one in more detail, because it can end up being something that is a bit abusive. I don't know. I'd need to look into more detail around that. I certainly understand the principle of it, and I certainly understand how it applies within major cities, because you've had like this, what is a true epidemic, and that the number of stabbings that took place in London, for example. I understand the principle behind it. I do think that if there was going to be something along those lines, then simultaneous to that, there needs to be other considered programs that are going to be able to present opportunity for learning that responsibility. Yeah, like I say, it's not something I'd be able to go into, and that just within this particular context. But I think something like that ends up having considerations above and beyond just simply saying that. So yeah, I would look at that. That's why I've highlighted it. I think it becomes a little bit more complicated than that. The end of early release absolutely should be just common sense. Absolutely for common sense. I mean, for violent crime and so forth, yeah, hell yeah. The innocent until proven guilty, yes, it should be obvious. I've highlighted the habeas corpus because on the website it's spelt incorrectly. But yes, and no more of this trial by media, and certainly not trial by bloody social media. Ending political correctness, hell yes. And there we go into this protected characteristics, and that is again the prime example that shows that this guy understands that particular area where some of these police officers they literally have come out and said that they will not investigate things because they're afraid of being called a racist, and tens of thousands of girls are being raped, and underage girls. I mean, it's just It's staggering that that could actually just be ignored. I can't, it's sickening. It really is sickening. So for somebody to understand that and actually have it as part of the manifesto, recognising that, there hasn't been another party that I'm aware of, and that's even come close to being able to say something like that. Appropriate funding. Yeah, I mean, the 20,000 police officers that were cut and so forth, and the botched privatisation, particularly within the prison and probation service, and that, I mean, yeah, that's been part of crony capitalism as far as I'm concerned. There are certain large organisations, and I will specifically state some people like Serco and G4S. They will be in for a reckoning, I would imagine. What the precise number of bobbies on the beat should be, I think it doesn't make sense to come out with arbitrary numbers at this stage. But again, in terms of having something that is equality before the law and actual law and order, again, who else does anybody know within the UK of political parties that is coming out with what should just be basic common decency and how you actually start to approach these subjects? I've not heard anybody else come up with it, which makes this a realistic proposition as far as I'm concerned. Which then leads into, because when you look at I will have the link to the website, so you'll be able to see, because I've edited the text down a bit, so you'll be able to get the full, not all of it, but some of it. So you'll get the full context on the website, and so you'll be able to see that this is not me stipulating what the manifesto is. This is actually from the manifesto itself, and also I've changed the order to what it is on the website according to what I think are actually the higher priorities. So the further we get through this, these are the lower the priority as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, liberty and free speech. There we go at the top, ending these lockdowns and laws for what is a disease no worse than a bad flu. About bloody time you had a political party that would say that. And it is an attack on civil liberties. Abso-bloody-lutely. This, again, somebody that actually recognises what is going on. This again, it's just, I don't know how many times I have to say this, but who else is actually presenting anything resembling common sense and understanding as to what the real problems are? And when we're all sitting back and going, well, what is it that we can actually do about these things? How can we actually understand whether we're being given the right information? Well, because you need to have the right bloody people in charge. And if you've got a party that actually recognises these problems, then it deserves to have the support. Right, free speech. Again, essentially what we'd said before in terms of this political correctness and whatever, and that, but being very much more specific. Controversial opinions, making jokes, and not having the idiots turn around and complain and say, I've had somebody say something I didn't like on Facebook. Grow up, piss off, get a life. The inciting violence or crime, again, certain parts of that, I mean, it does depend, because this is where this reclaiming language becomes important. Because if we don't reclaim language, then the incitement to violence in particular, you're going to end up with a problem when you end up with these morons that are turning around and saying, well, silence is violence. You know, I mean, all this sort of nonsense. So this is why reclaiming the language is absolutely critical. There should be no wiggle room for these absolute morons to keep shoving their ridiculous ideology So freedom of speech it is critical. Code of conduct for employment to allow freedom of expression. Yes, absolutely. Universities especially. The universities have just lost the plot. And I don't know if anybody's seen the stuff that's going around at the moment, and that you've actually got some academics from Oxford and one from three so-called doctors from Oxford. Doctors are bullshit, basically, from Oxford, and one from York University, that are apparently advising the government as to how that they can push mandatory vaccines, where there's a very insidious element within their so-called suggestions that are going to be very open to abuse, whereby anybody that claims that they have the right to bodily integrity, that they will be able to then suggest that that person is suffering from a mental health condition and therefore they do not need to give consent in order to be able to have a vaccine forced upon them. So what is coming out of universities, and also take into consideration the number of people from these universities that are contributing to this great reset, including was it Thomas Hale, who has been one of the people that has contributed to the global governance perspective, because he doesn't like the fact that Donald Trump had been the president. He doesn't like the fact that Erdogan had been voted in Turkey. He doesn't like the fact that we'd voted for Brexit. I mean, real toys out the pram tantrum, silly little shit. But these people are getting their way at the moment. They are pushing their agendas through. So holding these people to account for this type of stuff is going to be absolutely critical. In terms of having social media reclassified as publishers, the reason why I wanted to highlight that is because I know immediately that there's going to be a problem put forward in terms of the fact that so many of these organisations are based out in the US, they're not in the UK, and therefore how can you do that? Well, the simple answer to that is that they haven't really struggled to be able to go through pandering to whatever the Communist Chinese Party have told them to do in order to be able to operate there. So they can do things on a nation by nation basis, and it is entirely plausible for the UK to demand that they are listed as publishers within the UK. So there is no get out clause on that one. So again, these are the types of areas and that no other party seems to be understanding in terms of the wider perspective. Targeting the methods that are used for pressing ideologies onto other people, making sure that kind of thing is removed. Again, increasing this understanding as to your own responsibility. These, because then it does turn around and say no forced medicines or vaccinations. So and it's not because I've read through this several times that I'm then jumping ahead of myself. I'm kind of going, like I say, I've ill prepared this. It's good that I'm pointing out these areas and then literally coming across it again, that it is a consistent point of view, and he does recognise these problems. The dystopian 24/7 surveillance, yes, again, the areas of technology, and obviously, and that is also then moves into making sure that cash does maintain its primary position and that they don't go into this cashless bloody Chinese credit system. Absolutely, we need to be able to keep that totally out of the realms of consideration. and for parents to be responsible for their kids, because as we'll go into in the further one, I believe there's very key considerations around this. But in terms of the technology part, once again, I need to be able to stress that it's taking back the terminology, because I have mentioned this previously, but I know that the term Industry 4.0 has been hijacked, and it's all being shoved towards being this as part of this great reset, and somehow the idea created by this Adolf Schwab, old fucking fat Jabba the Hutt, the proper bloody Nazi. He didn't create Industry 4.0. That was done through the Fraunhofer Institute. He has just literally grabbed a hold of it and done what all of these people do, because he never got an original thought. He's just bastardized it. Industry 4.0 is about having technologies to assist with manufacturing, to have an efficient use of manufacturing. So it's essentially, that is to help with the quality as well. Not equality, but quality, the quality of product. It's also to make sure that things like products are not stolen from a warehouse or misplaced. Things of this nature. It's not about surveilling the entire population and trying to keep an eye on what you're doing 24/7. That's not what that's supposed to be about. So reclaiming that part of the language is important as well. Because if people do turn around and say, well, we have this particular system that is to go into a manufacturing facility to do to perform the purposes that it was actually intended, and you say, well, okay, it's based around setting up an Industry 4.0 compliant factory, immediately people are going to think, well, okay, what's that got to do with this great reset? Is this now going to be a part of this ideology that we're looking to avoid? Well, no, it's not. Take back the language. Not all technology is based around trying to destroy your lives. And it does go a great way towards, when done correctly and when you actually do understand it, it does go a great way towards being able to reduce the cost to the consumer. This is why you've ended up with these scenarios of factories that have moved over to China and what have you, because it's a lower cost of production. Well, you can reduce the cost of production by utilising technologies to assist with that. Does that mean that there are less jobs within manufacturing? Yes, it does have an impact to that. But then it also can make up from the back end of producing and supporting those systems as well. So there are areas of levelling out, and whereby certain jobs can be lost at one part of the equation, you can make up for on the other. So it's not all about just everything being automated. There are things that are called lights out factories, where literally everything is automated, but that type of thing ends up being much more of a pipe dream. So anyway, these types of areas, I think the freedom of speech part of things, and that it does include reclaiming speech as well. Low immigration. This is one that should please quite a few people. There is the identified problem of millions, potentially millions of undocumented illegal immigrants. There is this, I mean, where it's turning around and saying previous governments signing into things like the Global Migration Compact and the Barcelona Declaration, etc. Where he's saying previous governments, it does include this government, and then those governments prior to that, and that's where the Barcelona Declaration and the Marrakesh Declaration come into play. Insofar as I'm concerned, and as I've stated previously, I would have us pulled out of the United Nations anyway, so none of that would apply. But yeah, the fact that all of that rubbish was signed up to without any consultation, and there was a petition against the government signing up to the Global Migration Compact, and it was completely ignored. It did get past the numbers required, and they just ignored it. Having the levels of migration brought down to sustainable levels, yes, does make sense. And we also, again, if you remember back to some of the data that I've already provided, the domestic population is currently in such a measure that it would be unable to maintain the current levels. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you were to end migration right now, you would slowly see the population numbers decrease. But it would... I don't think there is an ideal number. This is one of the problems that we've had throughout, whereby everybody seems to demand, well, I say everybody, I mean, you get media morons that demand to have a specific number put on things. It's not about that. It's about the supply and demand. It's got nothing to do with who you're going to let in and how many of them that you're going to let in. If you don't have the jobs and you don't have the facilities, you don't have the infrastructure, and you don't have the housing, the healthcare, the schools, etc., etc. If you don't have these things in place to be able to cope with large numbers, then you can't do it. Now, obviously, again, that because of this Great Reset appeasement scenario, there is a distinct element to that, which is something that I haven't really got into too far in the Sisyphus complex solution, which is around to eugenics plans, and that is based on reducing the population to significantly less than what we have at the moment. And this is obviously being played out with the fact that they are intentionally implementing policies to, no polite way of saying it, but basically kill off pensioners. These kind of areas and that, I mean, if we can get rid of all of those types of influences, and then we just look logically as towards what kind of people it is that we actually want to see coming into the country, and not just opening the doors to any moron that wants to come over on a dinghy. I mean, literally, it's got to be a case of, right, you've come over on a dinghy, back you go. Don't care, off you go. And that's where we get the things like this border protection and the citizens first, and then returning to accountability. It all falls along the same lines. Ugh, I'm going to need a bit more drink, I think. Because, again, I don't know how long this has been going on for, but I don't care, it's all going to be said. This is going to be a long party political broadcast. Get over it. Those that are found to be here that are illegal should be sent back immediately to wherever they came from. Don't care where that was. If they're illegal, they go. These types of things need to be put into place. An end, I would suggest, to all of this. Yeah, you got the spurious claims for asylum. All of this type of thing needs to end. Again, when have you come across a party that is prepared to say what should be common sense and what has been a part of a sensible legal system to date that has just suddenly become bastardized as it goes along? You can't We can't allow this kind of nonsense to continue. So, once more, this is somebody that is understanding what the problems are, up and down the country, because I'm sick of this sort of stuff and that being, let's say, London centric and whatever, and that, and all of these whining about, oh well, London needs to have a diverse population. No, you bloody well don't. You need to have a responsible population. Maybe you won't have quite so many beggars on the streets in London if you stop all this nonsense. Because I'm sick of that when I go to London. The amount of people that are going around begging, that are homeless. You'd think that immigration's got nothing to do with that. I'm certainly sick of all of this nonsense of these buggers turning up on our beaches willy-nilly. And the absolute, complete and utter failure of the politicians, and intentional failure to do anything about it. We need people that will. Right, national sovereignty. Obviously there's the stuff about having left the European Union, and we still haven't. It literally is a farce. Like I say, when you look into this stuff around the Great Reset, and they do complain, the little lefty arseholes out of Oxford University throwing their toys out of the pram because Brexit was voted upon. The key part of that is that, once again, it was lip service paid by Boris, and if agreements have not been reached by a particular date, then that's it, we walk away, we go WTO. That didn't last, did it? He's done exactly what all the others do, and he's basically reneged on that immediately. So we are, as he quite rightly states, we are a vassal state. We're not members to anything, but we're still paying into it, and we are subject to all of those laws. There is no ability for the UK to be able to go out and do trade deals with anybody whilst they maintain this vassal state. And they're doing it on purpose. Because let's face it, as things stand, the more they're pushing with this Great Reset, it's not going to really matter anyway, and that because you're going to be part of this one world governance, which nobody voted for. So, having somebody that understands that, obviously in that David will be very much aware of this and that because he was previously a member of UKIP, so this is something that's made a good part of his political history already. The exclusive economic zone for fishing, yep, makes sense. When he says it's best to agree a mutually beneficial trade deal with the EU, I'm not really overly convinced that that is even remotely worthy of consideration anymore. For me personally, on that, I think this sort of stuff, it can't. There's less and less an opportunity for this to be an overriding, across the board agreement, and it is going to have to be something that is based on sector by sector, because I don't necessarily think that we need to have these levels of relationships across all sectors anyway. Let's if there's going to be areas of protectionism, which the European Union is based entirely around protectionism, then let's have some of our own. And then if they don't like it, then trading on WTO for now, because there is a second part to this. Operating on WTO for now, it's not that big of a deal. As much as you got all of the whiners that essentially they all make up the appeasement brigade, if they can't do a bit of paperwork and if they can't understand how to operate on on WTO terms, then frankly, to hell with them. Let them go out of business and let somebody that's competent take over. That sort of thing doesn't bother me in the slightest. But then this leads into the memberships side of things, where again it would be a case of do we, don't we, because in terms of NATO, I mean more specifically WTO and the UN Security Council, I would argue that if we are going to get away from the United Nations and leave all of the tentacles of the United Nations, because they are the ones that have been responsible for the largest part of pushing this appeasement programme, that does mean leaving the WTO as well. Now, I don't think that there's any problem in being able to develop a new legitimate nation-to-nation agreement, and whereby in terms of international arbitration, that would essentially be the system that you look towards setting up. Is there an existing solution along those lines? Potentially, yes. I won't name them at the moment, and that because I do think that they are also very much lined up with all of this world governance nonsense. And I also know that the guys that head up, at least on the UK side of things, not only are they lined up with this agenda, but they're also hugely incapable. They're not even qualified to do it. So might be something that's a little bit more of a long-term plan, but something certainly worth taking forward. The Five Eyes, again, is that going to be something that we're going to have to seriously think about? Because if Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the US are going to fall in line with this agenda, then might not be of the best interests of the nation to be working together with people that have got anything but our best interests at heart. So it kind of depends what takes place around the world as to what it is that we do actually make sure that we are a member of. This has got nothing to do with being a small nation that is cut off from everybody. This is being a nation that is making sure that the population is maintaining its legitimate freedoms and not being interfered with by people that do not have our interests at heart. So these kind of areas and that need to be very, very carefully considered. I'm glad that he's then mentioning that I mean, TTIP I think is basically dead in the water anyway. I'm sure Biden will try to reignite it because it's one of their idiot things. And the Paris Climate Agreement, yep, get out of that. It's nonsense. And the European Convention on Human Rights, yes, I would also get rid of that. We need to go back to the common law, and that is another area which, in terms of aspects that are not currently included within the manifesto, and something that I've been something that's been rather prevalent over the last couple of days, has been to do with this common law and the problems that have been brought about because of all of this lockdown nonsense. It is quite apparent that we do need to have a written constitution in the UK. We don't have one. We do need one. I think that would be quite an important part of the manifesto going forward. But like I say, these are the types of areas that not only become an increasing part of the pitch deck, but then things that we need to be putting together in terms of the real nuts and bolts in a business plan behind it. Constitution becomes incredibly important. The fact that, again, as you can see towards the bottom of that where I've highlighted, he does understand Agenda 21 and 2030, and it's about time that somebody did, that they recognised it, rather than our appeasing government that has got Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 written all over the government web pages. It's an absolute farce. And yes, get rid of things like these carbon trading systems and forget all of the pseudoscience around climate alarmism, I mean climatards, I would say. Get rid of all of that sort of nonsense, because none of it, I mean these are the two key areas at the moment that are being shoved down people's throats, where if you're too lazy to find out, the climate nonsense is based in no scientific evidence whatsoever. The COVID nonsense is based on no scientific evidence whatsoever. It's just things being rammed down your throat to make you fearful, and to just be the bedwetters that are prepared to sit back and wear your bloody face nappies and do as you're told, because they've come out with some lies, predominantly out of the likes, like saying you're getting out of Imperial and Oxford University and what have you, where there is no academic credibility to any of these people anymore. So again, this is very, very good that you've got somebody that actually understands where the real problems are. Education. There are some key areas around this. Like I said, I mean, I shouldn't have to go through literally every moment and every word that is said here and that, because you know it's there on the screen for a reason. Read the bloody stuff. Grammar schools, technical schools, general schools, yes. There's some important parts within this that I wanted to really get to, in terms of the highlighted in yellow, paying off the student loans for those who are involved in STEM subjects. That would be a very popular part of the manifesto in terms of the younger people, where they don't end up with a great deal of student debt. However, the same thing applies as to every time this has been mentioned by any other party, predominantly those in Labour. Any kind of mention of this kind of scenario means it must be costed. And because the numbers of places, I mean, yes, obviously, I mean, when I was going through the education system in the UK, I mean, obviously, in that my university studies and so forth, and that they were done out in Japan at an American university, which I had to pay for myself. The change from free education to the grant and loan system took place when I was at college. Obviously, it wasn't anything like the ridiculous cost that kids are being levied with at the moment. So I think just stating that outright, I think, is potentially a little bit of an error, because there are elements around this that need an awful lot more consideration. So, for example, yes, I understand that if you want people to be going towards subjects that are going to be of the greatest benefit, then look at the kinds of numbers that you're talking about. How many kids are we talking about? Making sure that when you're talking about STEM subjects, we've got the distinct problem at the moment of so many colleges, universities, schools that are entirely ideologically bent. And so any school of that particular ideology, first and foremost, they need those peoples weeded out and gotten rid of. And then above that, and the way to be able to force them out, is that if there are any universities that are not teaching people correctly, they are not entitled to have their students have free education. That's first and foremost. That would be one way to be able to prevent problems. If we have considerations around being able to reduce the cost, because again, when you look at I mean, if you compare universities from my day to what they look like now, first and foremost, the numbers are tenfold. Second of all, there's a great concentration towards foreign students. And then the areas that they're concentrated on in terms of being able to make these institutions financially viable, the method of them doing so is based on, as far as I'm concerned, punishing students and not being able to make best use of where they could actually generate revenue for themselves. I have alluded to this sort of thing before in terms of how they have distinct failures in their ability to understand how to monetize intellectual property. So it does require a root and branch consideration as to how something like that can be achieved, which is why I worry about having a statement like we would pay off student loans, because I think it becomes far more complicated than that. Yeah, part of a conversation, but in terms of an end goal, to be able to incentivize the schools to be able to be teaching the things that they are supposed to teach, to be able to attract the teachers that are going to be able to understand actual science rather than pseudoscience, so that we can then remove all of this nonsense around, especially around these climatard morons, and you won't end up with idiots then that are advising the government over the likes of COVID and coming up with models that make absolutely no sense whatsoever and are so plainly and absolutely openly show that these people have no clue what they're doing, and it's all based on fear porn and ideology and pushing their Adolf Schwab appeasement scenario onto everybody. We do need people that are going to be in the schools that are actually going to be educating on the basis of evidence, epistemology, enlightenment, facts. Things of this nature are incredibly important. Going back to, the apprenticeships and the polytechnics and so forth, yes, to a degree I understand that, and because obviously polytechnics were around in my day. Again, we need to be looking at what the financial model is for this type of thing. Apprenticeships, I do tend to consider to be something that has shifted as having much more of a governmental responsibility than should be the case, especially for the larger organisations. Because if you're in a larger organisation and you want somebody to learn the trade, it should be a part of your investment in the individual. You can turn around and potentially have contractual obligations to a youngster to say, well, okay, well, we expect X number of years of service in order for us to invest in training you for this. I don't necessarily see that as being a problem. I don't know. I'm not convinced that everything has to be based on government doing these types of things. The polytechnics, they do tend to be this scenario. Essentially, if you've got a polytechnic, I think the way that it used to work, I don't know what they do these days. Like I said, this is where I'd have to look into things in a lot more detail, because I haven't come across this part of the Sisyphus complex solution yet. If you're at college or like the polytechnic, if you're there for say 4 days a week and then you're going into a company for 1 day a week, then obviously the cost obligation for that organisation that is having you for that 1 day, then that cost is their burden. So I think there are ways to be able to arrange things in a much more common sense way that essentially that we used to have. The care obviously then is based on the numbers of kids going into higher education or technical education, because it's an awful lot more than it used to be. This is where the problems of costings have come in to be an issue. But there's certainly areas where I think, I mean, the vocational fields and that can be much more based on entrepreneurialism as well, because you don't necessarily have to go to university to become an entrepreneur by any stretch of the imagination. So having people understand how they actually go about starting a business, what are the real core areas that they need to be, because when I was at college here before I went to Japan, that was at a technical college, and that was studying business and finance. But the methods that were employed to present the academic advice, well, I mean the basic education. What am I talking about? The education that was presented in terms of being able to put together a business. It did obviously touch on things like business plans, but nowhere near to the level that would actually be required, and it certainly didn't go into anything like areas of being able to achieve finance, understanding what the private equity markets are. So having something that is much more practical would be a great benefit in these areas, and enabling things for kids that have some level of idea, and this is where I think there's opportunities for retired people as well to be utilised much better in terms of mentorship programs. These kinds of areas I think would be very useful, but like I say, as a basis for what is being presented for a manifesto, fine, it's the details that we need to be looking at. But again, these are areas which the existing parties just completely ignore. Family values. Here we've got an issue that some people are going to like, some people are not, but there is a basic perspective here, and that if we are going to turn around and have responsibilities, if we are going to have people understanding the kind of traditions that develop a much more responsible society as a whole, then it is based on this nuclear family that Black Lives Matter want to try to destroy, and any of these leftist morons. There are going to be issues in terms of I would imagine your LGBTs and that are going to go screaming up and down the roads about this sort of thing. But the simple fact of the matter is, the key part of this is being able to get rid of all of this queer theory and the gender fluidity and all of the absolute, again, pseudoscience bollocks. Get rid of all of that and have somebody that is pushing something which is going to assist the stability of society, which is having people being responsible again for, and having responsible families. People are actually looking after their kids, understanding that a family is, and a marriage is, between a man and a woman. And like I say, LGBTs are really not going to like that, but I don't care. I genuinely don't care. It's been quite clear that this statement from years ago, and that if you start entering into those realms and that you start off on that slippery slope, it is quite apparent what has happened in terms of this slippery slope. So there's no real need to go too far in this, because I mean it is quite clear in that. I mean, in terms of keeping kids from going off the rails and things of this nature, having a stable family. But I suppose the one element that I would add to this is that it seems quite clear that as much as there's the concentration within this manifesto as to the problems that are being faced by young boys in particular, and how the single parent family can lead to problems with kids later on. It does also miss out on the very distinct point that it's the parents that need education as well, because parents these days are quite frankly appalling. They are so wrapped up in themselves, and that they seem to think having a child is, the latest thing that you can put on Facebook, like, oh, look what I got, and then just completely ignore it because it's not fashionable tomorrow. This sort of nonsense, parents needing to understand what being a parent actually is. And one of the key areas around that is the fact that if parents have actually been responsible parents, you wouldn't end up with these problems within the education sector, because you would have been talking to your children to say, well, what did you learn at school today? And the moment they do turn around and talk about, and it does point to here and that, and something that I have brought up in SCS already, and that I will be going into more detail later on, in terms of some of this absolutely disgraceful sexualization of children in schools. Your parents would be turning around and asking the question, learning about what their kids have been told at school, and then being able to go into that school and say, don't you dare shove that bullshit down my kids' throats. We will not tolerate it. Parents need to take responsibility. So an awful lot of the education here is based on what the parents need to be doing as well. Like I say, I mean, one of the biggest issues that I have pointed out on a number of occasions in various different formats is that we always end up with this scenario of people turning around and saying, but the kids have become this way. Oh no, the kids are doing that and the kids are doing the other. You always forget, where's the parents in all of this? Where is the parental responsibility? I'm not interested in all of this. Oh, well, I'm a single parent and therefore I don't have time for this, that and the other. Make bloody time. You took the time to drop your knickers or get your wang out. Take the time to look after the results of it. And in terms of this type of thing, generally speaking, you're going to end up with, I think this might go into in a different area, but I'm just going to say it one way or the other anyway. There's an awful lot of emphasis that is based on the female responsibility. Once again, it becomes a case of stop putting all of the emphasis on one part of the equation. So in terms of kids, if they have been taught badly because the parents haven't bothered their arse to make sure that they're being cared for and educated correctly, same applies in terms of maintaining a relationship. It is not just down to the woman. Men have to learn to be men again. Stop all of this wuss nonsense. Find the fact that you're supposed to have a pair of testes there somewhere. Learn your responsibilities. Because it's quite apparent there's a lot of failings around that. And I'm a fine one to talk. Because obviously I'm not with my lads. So, voice of experience. The voice of somebody that is actually not necessarily made entirely the same mistakes, because at least I made sure that my lads and that had their own pair of balls and that, and they knew what was right and wrong. I made sure that they know that. But there's too many that just have entirely selfish perspectives. The father is too busy running off and that and trying to pretend to be the big I am, whilst being an absolute wuss when faced with anything. The mother is too busy running around and that claiming her bloody femininity and her rights and that, and her body, her rights, and blah blah blah, while spewing out kids willy-nilly. Or more than likely, these days it seems to be fashionable, and that's just to go out and get an abortion whenever you feel like it. I mean, that's that sort of thing as well, and that is just fucking phenomenal. Don't understand that sort of thing. And I can say that from personal experience that I do know about that sort of stuff as well. It is all sides of the equation. It's not just putting all the emphasis on the kids. At the same time, it's not about putting all emphasis on the women. It's each part of the equation. Men, grow some balls. Be actual men for a change. And go from being men to being gentlemen. How about that? That doesn't generally exist too much anymore, does it? And instead of women becoming and taking up this feminist perspective of somehow thinking that you're becoming a male equivalent means that you have to become the worst version of a man and essentially just walking around being an Irish navvy. Maybe try being a lady instead, and then the pair of you look after your bloody kids. So some proper, and like I say, above all, make sure that your schools are not pushing the sexualisation of your children, because I can't believe the Conservative government have allowed that to come in. Being British and proud, protecting your culture and heritage. Again, this is not something that should be open to question. The very fact that this would have to be mentioned is incredible. Again, and he's quite correctly, and once again somebody that is actually identified about this long march through the institutions. And as much as he's talking about Marxist groups, yes, there are Marxist groups, but I still go with the fact that an awful lot of this is more to do with the more fascistic elements, shall we say. And all of this nonsense about how Britain is the worst country in the world and how everything is based around the colonisation and how terrible we were to everybody is just absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And it's about time we started to get a sense of pride again. The same should stand for any country. There is no reason why anybody should be accepting all of this rubbish and that, trying to make everybody feel ashamed of where they come from. Again, it's part of that growing your balls. Being proud. If you've got something to be proud of and something to be holding belief in terms of a greater good within your own nation, the more chance there is that you're going to run side by side with that the sense of responsibility, the sense of wanting to achieve things not only for yourself but for your kids and for your wider community. I mean, the few years that I did notice that things like the oh god, what is it? St George's Day. It's terrible for me to forget that. Some of the celebrations that we used to see in the pubs around St George's Day, because for the longest time you'd had you got your St Patrick's Day that everybody knows about. I can't remember what the bloody Scottish and the Welsh ones are, but I mean, I'm not Scottish or Welsh, so why would I care? But there wasn't really much in terms of St George's. I mean, if the Scottish want to have whatever their day is and that, great, do that. If the Welsh want it, great, do that. But for the English to do the same thing as well, that is not something that should be sneered at. That is something that should be celebrated. And then we should all turn round, like I say, if they develop that constitution in particular, then there should be a British Day where we can all celebrate together. These types of areas to give people that sense of belonging that is quite clearly being taken away from us. So these kinds of areas, and yeah, literally, anybody that doesn't like that, do a preserving our environment, and I've put this one in that as actual conservatism. That is my terminology there. This is not environmentalism. This is preserving the environment. There's a very big difference, and this is in terms of making sure that the land is put to best use and that it is not abused, and you don't end up having the scenario where the lunacy of the environmentalists actually being the ones that are prepared to go around and destroy the countryside. They will stick bloody idiot wind farms everywhere as far as they're concerned, and solar panels. I mean, how the hell that is supposed to be preserving the environment is beyond me. I mean, that would end up being a much larger conversation, but seriously, it's retarded. So having an understanding not only of the countryside, but best use of the agriculture, because there does need to be this proper understanding as to having domestic production and domestic food sources. I mean, these things used to be just common sense, that you make sure that what is protected within your nation, just in case of any critical problem, that you have sufficient food, clothing, housing, and I would include energy. These things on a domestic level are absolutely important, and they need to be maintained. You're going to get that through the protection of your, or preservation of your environment on that basic understanding. Now, it can also go forward, as he mentions here, and that's around ensuring that the fishing is maintained, because again, that feeds within your domestic food supply. Absolutely fine. And yes, I do agree in terms of having, if necessary, have the Navy getting involved in that to protect our waters. Areas around the new homes and commercial buildings. I mean, this is something that actually feeds into an area that had been intentionally disrupted. Anybody who understands or knows about Roger Scruton, he was somebody that was presenting the fact that a lot of modern developments are essentially just creating these incredibly ugly homes and buildings that just do not fit within the surroundings. And for my part, I mean, having spent so long out in Japan, I do understand what a place looks like when you've got this mishmash of people just building whatever it is that they want, and you can walk along any given road, and everything it just looks totally bizarre in comparison to what you'd expect in the UK. I mean, is it a bad thing for Japan? No, I mean, that's entirely up to them. But in terms of the UK, within a number of the real heritage towns in particular, I suppose prime examples would be the area that I come from. So if you've got in certain parts of Warwick, and then a little bit further on, obviously, in that you've got Stratford, where you have the old black and white beam buildings and so forth, you can't realistically then have a 2 up 2 down brick monolith stuck by the side of it, which just looks completely out of place. And surely, once again, that the more that a home looks like something that the owner can have pride in, it will give them greater incentive to be able to maintain and look after it correctly. If you've basically just got this just slap up any old crap, and somebody's gone in there because that's basically all they could afford, and they couldn't give a damn, then you basically end up with an area that becomes a shithole. So all of these different things feed into it. If Roger Scruton had been allowed to continue, I mean, he was removed from his position under the most ridiculously spurious terms, and it was actually under falsehoods and how those blue socialist conservatives just turned on him was absolutely infuriating and frankly disgusting. But he was making precisely this point, that the more, I suppose, beautification you have in terms of what your town, city looks like, and the development, any new developments, if they're in fitting within that, then the more pride and responsibility and care will come about from the individuals that live within those buildings as well, or work in those buildings. So it does have that knock-on effect. So understanding the different areas of what preserving your environment means does become an important part. Nearly getting there, I think. Right, so some actual conservatism again. The culture. Oh, and here we go, and that into this, he's mentioning about the abortions and how many abortions there are, and it's abortion is not a fashion. Since when all of this killing babies has become something that people want to rally for, and I really don't understand it. But again, I don't want to put all of the burden onto women here, because it makes sense, and it's very simple to turn around and say, okay, let's have something out there that says, women, stop dropping your knickers every 5 seconds. At the same time, men has the responsibility as well. So it does become a dual perspective, and it all becomes this basis of just learning some basic responsibility. I mean, it does come down as well, and that to these various idiot so-called influencers, where you've had these moron women that have turned around and said, oh, I wished I'd had an abortion and then my life would have been better. I said, oh, shut up, you stupid bitch. Who cares? How about if you didn't drop your knickers in the first place? And again, the fella, if you've got a woman that is that much of an idiot, do you really want to dip your wick? How about having a look somewhere that's a little bit more clean? Because, yeah, those problems do exist as well. I mean, this is why I've highlighted the providing mothers with help. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I think this, again, it has to be this. It has to be this perspective of teaching responsibility rather than help as such. I mean, for Christ's sake, they wanted the pill, you got the pill. Blokes, you got your rubber johnnies. You know, use the bloody things. If you're not prepared to handle the responsibility of your actions, don't do it. Use your hand. It literally is as simple as that. Because this blasé approach towards, I mean, I'd love to see these people, because it is coming in the UK as well, and that. I mean, it's already reached this stage in California, and I know how this shit works and that, and it's going to be over here as well. I mean, they're literally turning around and saying, giving the choice of abortion up to the point of birth. Now, if you take that to its logical comparison, does that then mean that any child that is, say, maybe 1 year old, you think, oh, well, I can't be bothered anymore, well, should we just get rid of that as well? Just kill that one as well? Because killing these kids, it ain't a fucking pretty sight. Some of you people might want to, some people, whether it's, like I said, both men and women, I mean, it could very well be a part of an education programme where if anybody's going to be forced to watch anything, show them what happens to a baby where they get pulled limb from limb. And understand that this blasé attitude towards it, that is literally what you are advocating. Responsibility first. Responsibility before murder. So that's a really important area. Sanctity of life for older and disabled people. Yes, obviously. Again, I mean, where he's got the do not resuscitate applied in hospitals. I mean, like I say, we are seeing a lot of that shit that's being put out in care homes. And this is why I don't know if anybody's seen the video and that woman that tried to get her mother out of a care home recently and then got arrested. I don't know. People need to be understanding this culture as well of looking after your parents rather than just trying to fob them off at the first available opportunity. Because again, you're too busy fucking about with social media or something like that. Get some responsibility. I can't believe these things have to actually be said. A part of this in terms of the sanctity of life of older and disabled people, well, older people in this instance, respecting your elders and wisers, because that is largely a truth. Yes, of course, there's always going to be the odd person of an age that has not learnt a single thing in their life and probably doesn't deserve a great deal of respect. But as a basic principle, learn to respect your elders again. But by the same token, if you remember, especially for your parents, and then it just spreads across, you have to be responsible as well in order to be able to earn that respect. Because so many people have lost it. Too many people they're demanding respect and they're not acting as though they deserve it. Bring that level of respect back. Let's see the elderly being cared for the way that they should be. Not being abused in care homes, not being ignored in hospitals, and not being ignored at home. This sort of stuff and that it should just be common sense, but it's something that has just quite clearly been lost. In terms of again, these activists refusing to treat children and things of this nature, again, it's outrageous. If there is, for whatever reason, if there is some kind of treatment that is available elsewhere, it shouldn't be a question. It really should not be a question. And if anything, the question should be, why isn't that treatment available here? And make damn well sure that it is. So again, these are just basic fundamentals that lead towards a cohesive society. And I can't believe that so many people have just let these basics go to pot because you're just all wrapped up in yourselves. So I mean, this sort of stuff and that, I mean, for a party to have these, we are at the end, a party to have these perspectives is long overdue. There are other areas that at the right point, like I say, I mean, when I mentioned previously, it's become even more critical now for us to have a constitution, a written constitution. There will be other areas that I will delve into as I develop the recreation of the Hoskins map. But in terms of a start point manifesto, if anybody didn't agree with those core principles, yeah, you don't belong here. It's as simple as that. You just don't belong in this country. Go and emigrate to wherever it is that they're just prepared to blunder along into oblivion of this leftist lunacy. We need to have this kind of a party that is prepared to say these things. And so I do encourage people to look at the Heritage Party. I do encourage people to join up. Exactly what my role will end up being there, I don't know. I could just end up being just a regular member. Who knows? I'm probably not the sort of person that should put myself front and centre and stand for any particular MP role or councillor role or whatever, that, because as you can tell, I'm a little bit too blunt in the way that I present myself. I'm not really interested in pandering to people, and I'm not really interested in trying to present myself as something that I'm not. And until we get a situation where both the general public and the media especially learn to grow up and stop trying to find insignificant little details to be able to go, oh, look at you, you're not allowed. Oh, you've got the wrong opinion. Until we can get rid of all that nonsense, then somebody like myself probably wouldn't get very far. Well, if discussions move forward and that, and I do end up taking up one of those seats, I'm not going to back down from my responsibilities. But like I say, that's not something that I'm going to be decided. I will continue with my Sisyphus complex solution. I will continue to feed in the details to this party, because I think that they are of a mind to understand what it is that I am putting together and the purpose of it and the suggestions that are being made. Will it be taken 100%? Probably not. Doesn't really matter. It's working towards something along those lines. Like I said, right from the start, this has not been about appallism. I'm more interested in working together with somebody that has got those core principles that align with what I believe is something that has been lost and that is currently being overtaken by appeasement to an agenda being pushed by a bunch of socialist retards in the United Nations, and quite frankly push what I can only describe as a Nazi at the World Economic Forum. And it literally is as bad as that. We've fought against this sort of stuff before, and anybody that's got half a brain can see that what these people are presenting is nothing more than a totalitarian state that goes against everything that this country, or frankly any other country, should be absolutely, adamantly, vehemently against and prepared to fight against. They had the balls to do that before. We need the balls to do it again. Do it at the ballot box if possible. Do it through the collective realisation initially within your own nation, and making sure that people understand that there are options out there that they can turn to. Like I said, I mean, if there are certain elements within this particular party where you think, well, okay, fundamentally, yes, in terms of an overall perspective, yes, I agree. However, there are a couple of aspects that I'm not comfortable with. Now's the time to make that known. This is the formative stages where you would be able to have that kind of input, provided we are based around an understanding of the wider perspective. So, I mean, if there's any lefty loony that thinks they're going to go and join this party and start telling us that we have to actually start calling men women and whatever, and that, then no, you're not going to be welcome, so fuck off. And you're not going to find anybody within this party that's prepared to pay you any heed whatsoever. I would certainly hope, and it certainly looks like it, at least from the top. Because otherwise, this will be another defunct party. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people to remember what the values are supposed to be. To remember what the British values are supposed to be. What you want to do in other countries is entirely up to you. I do suggest you try to find anybody out in other countries. You do need to find or form something similar. That's up to you. But in terms of the UK, I think the people in this country need to remember what has been fought for in the past and how you are letting it all go. And you are literally shifting into appeasement, the likes of which certain cowards in the UK were prepared to try to fall in line with in 1939. And it took one man with the balls to say no. And the public got behind that man. Because that is what the British people are supposed to be about. It's about time we remembered that. So, a long episode, I dare say. Don't care. I wanted to give a perspective as to what the Heritage Party is, why this has been the one party that I've actually joined. I've never joined a party before. Why it's important, what the values are, and what I think people need to be aware of, that we have actually got a politician out there that understands the scenarios that are being pushed upon us, where it actually comes from and how it can be dealt with. So, up to all of you. If you want to ask some questions of me, and that, feel free. I will put the link in the description. I do strongly suggest, like I say, join up. It's about time that people started to stand up and stand up against this increasing totalitarianism, especially now that we're in lockdown again, which is based on nothing other than just progressing this agenda. Do we want to be appeasers, or will we fight back? Up to you. Okay, so best of luck to all of us, because we're going to fucking need it. But I'm up for the fight. Are you? Let's hope there's enough of us. Alright, well, I'll call this one to an end. Next week, go back to the regular processes. Alright, cheers. Take care, bye-bye.